The laughter came first, before she had even crossed the threshold. She had not expected silence. Silence was a luxury she had learned not to count on, not in rooms where Viscount Alderley held court. But she had not expected this, either, the sharp, bright sound of her former betrothed's amusement, cutting through the hum of the assembly like a blade through silk, aimed. She understood in the same breath, at her. She stopped in the doorway of the Chandler house's receiving room, her hand still resting on the frame, and counted to 4 in the language of plant taxonomy she kept for emergencies, aconitum, belladonna, cicuta, digitalis. And by the time she reached the 4th, her face had settled into the expression she wore like a second gown. Polite, distant, faintly curious, as though the laughter were a sound from another room entirely. "Still fat," said Viscount Alderley to the man beside him, not troubling to lower his voice. "I'd have thought country air would do something for it." She had not yet known, in that moment, how much the next half hour would cost her. Had she known, she would have walked into the room anyway. Her name was Mira Voss. She was 26, a physician's daughter, and she had spent the better part of a year in the Alderley country house in the professional capacity of companion to the Viscount's elder aunt, a role that was, in practice, a little less than a companion, and a little more than a very educated unpaid nurse, which suited her because the aunt was excellent and the wage, when it came, was reliable. She was not beautiful in any way the assembly would have recognized, and she did not try to be. She was, however, the only person in the Chandler house's receiving room who could identify all 4 of the plants she had just named by their dried root samples alone, and who understood that the tincture presently warming in the blue-painted cabinet at the back of the room was composed incorrectly, and that the person who had composed it had done so deliberately, and that the person most likely to consume it before midnight was the one man in England whose death would settle a great deal of money on the very wrong sort of people. She knew this because she had been watching for 3 weeks, and because she had a gift for seeing what other people arranged to be invisible. She crossed the room. The assembly parted, not courteously, in the way that crowds part for someone who does not appear to notice them, which is different from courtesy but achieves most of the same effects. Alderley watched her come with the particular expression of a man who had once been refused and had decided to call the refusal someone else's mistake. He was handsome, Alderley. This was always the first thing said about him, which was the reason it was the last thing she ever thought. He had dark eyes and a fashionable coat and hands she had once, briefly, imagined would be kind. Miss Voss. He said it the way one says a thing to prove it costs nothing to say it. My lord. She said it the way one closes a ledger. She did not stop walking. She was already past him, already at the sideboard, already with her back to the blue-painted cabinet, already in the exact position she had chosen from the doorway when she first saw where the cabinet sat in relation to the door and the hearth and the chair where the Duke of Ashmore was presently seated with his glass still half full and his eyes already on her, which she had not expected, and which she filed away under things to examine later. The Duke of Ashmore did not look like a duke. This was the first thing she noted, and she noted it in the professional rather than the romantic sense. He looked like a man who had spent a good deal of time outdoors, doing things that required his hands rather than his signature, which his rank should not have permitted. He was large in a still way, the way a stone is large, not imposing so much as simply present, as though the room had been arranged around him without his participation and without his interest. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His jaw carried the shadow of a man who had more pressing concerns than a razor. He was not looking at her the way Alderley had been looking at her. He was looking at her the way one watches a person do something surprising, which is to say with the specific attention of someone recalibrating. She had a fortnight. She had learned this from the Viscount's aunt, who had let it slip in the way that kind women let things slip when they are trying to warn you without quite warning you. The estate accounts were due at the quarter, which meant the trustees were due at the quarter, which meant the Duke of Ashmore, who was the primary trustee of the Alderley estate, would be at Chandler House only until Michaelmas. 14 days. She had already spent 3 of them watching the cabinet. 11 days remaining. She turned slightly, enough to be polite, and looked directly at the Duke of Ashmore, and said, "Quietly, Your Grace, I wonder if you have tried the wine." He set his glass down. He had very dark eyes, and they did not move from her face. "I have not. I would not," she said, and then she said nothing further, and waited. He was quiet for 2 full breaths. Then, "Is there something wrong with it?" "There is something wrong with the cabinet beside you. The wine itself," she said, "is, I believe, perfectly adequate." Alderley, across the room, laughed again, but this time the sound did not quite carry the same brightness. She heard it change in transit. The Duke of Ashmore stood. He was taller than she had calibrated, which meant her original assessment required a minor adjustment. He picked up the glass, not the blue cabinet, not the decanter, the glass, which she had not said anything about, and handed it to a footman without appearing to look at one. He said, in a voice that carried no more volume than a sentence said across a breakfast table, "Clear the cabinet." That was the moment she understood she was dealing with someone who already suspected something. She filed this too. She did not know, yet, what it was going to cost her. She knew only that the accounts were overdrawn, and the cabinet was wrong, and there were 11 days remaining, and that the Viscount of Alderley's laughter had a shape she recognized. The shape of a man who has decided he cannot afford to be seen losing, which is the most dangerous shape a small man's pride can take. She could not have told you, standing there in the Chandler House's receiving room, in a gown that was not fashionable and had not been fashionable when it was new, that the Duke of Ashmore would follow her into the conservatory 3 minutes later. She could not have told you that he would close the door quietly, the way careful men close doors when they are afraid of disturbing something they haven't named yet. She could not have told you any of it. But she knew, in the bone-deep way, she knew which plants were medicines and which were poison, that the next 11 days were going to be the most expensive of her life. She was wrong about that, as it happened. They were going to be considerably more expensive than that, and she would not, afterward, say she wished they had cost less. The Duke of Ashmore came into the conservatory and left the door not quite latched. He stood 3 feet from her beside a trestle of winter early narcissi, and he looked at her with the expression she would come to know as his thinking expression, which was identical to his every other expression, except marginally stiller. "You identified a tampered preparation at 20 feet, he said, not a question. "At 32 feet, she said. "The smell carries." Whoever made it did not understand that antimony has a particular quality in warm air. Antimony, he said the word carefully, the way one says a thing one already knew and is now certain of. "You are Voss's daughter, the physician in the North Quarter who died in the spring." Yes, she squared the cuffs of her gown, corner to corner, a habit she had from her father. "You knew him. He saved my brother's life. I was 17. He paused. "I did not know he had a daughter." "Very few people did," she said. "He found it useful, and so did I." There was a silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It had the quality of 2 people assessing the weight of what they have each just put on the table. "Who," he said, "do you believe made the preparation?" She looked at him. He was watching her with that calibrating attention, and she recognized in it something she rarely encountered: genuine inquiry, no performance of it. He wanted the actual answer. "I have not yet enough to lay it before you," she said. "I have suspicion." Suspicion is the beginning of a case, not the case itself. "How long do you need?" She counted. 11 days to Michaelmas. Give me a week." He looked at her for a long moment. His hands were at his sides, still, the way a man holds his hands when he is resisting an impulse. "Miss Voss," he said, "you are presently employed as Mrs. Alderley's companion." "I am. And the man who laughed at you in the receiving room is the Viscount whose estate accounts I am presently reviewing." "He is. And you are asking me to trust you." "I am asking you," she said, "to wait 1 week. You may trust whatever you like." He looked at her. And then she would mark it afterward, because it was the first, and she did not expect it. The corner of his mouth moved, very slightly, in a direction that was not quite a smile, but was at least in the same county as one. 1 week, he said. She nodded and turned back to the Narcissi and listened to him open the door and close it, just as carefully as before. The hinges did not make a sound. She stood alone in the conservatory for a moment and breathed in the cold green scent of the flowers and permitted herself to note, once, that he had not looked at her as though she were a thing that could be categorized and dismissed. She noted it. She did not permit herself to count it. There was work to do. The Alderley house kept its accounts in a study on the east corridor, behind a door that was locked between 9 in the evening and 7 in the morning, and left on the latch at every other hour. Because the Viscount believed that people who had legitimate business in his study would not require a lock, and people who did not have legitimate business would be deterred by one. This was the sort of reasoning that passed for security among men who had never met anyone cleverer than themselves in a context that mattered. Mira had been inside the study 7 times. She had never been asked to be there, which meant she had never been noticed leaving. Mrs. Alderley, the Viscount's aunt, who was 63 and had a spine like a wrought iron railing, and said what she thought, and had thought, since the day she met Mira, that the girl was being wasted as a companion, had told her, in the early days, he locks the cabinet. Not the study. The cabinet. And she had tapped the side of her nose, which meant she knew something was in the cabinet and had decided it was not her business to know what, but that it was perhaps Mira's. The cabinet was a different one from the Chandler House cabinet, Mira now understood. There were several cabinets. This was a detail. She had found the first ledger on her 3rd visit, behind a panel she'd identified by the smell. Cedar and chalk, the same combination her father had used to seal documents against damp, and she had not moved it, only read it, which she did the way she did most things, quickly, completely, without leaving a mark. The numbers were wrong. They were wrong in the specific, sophisticated way that numbers are wrong when they have been made wrong by someone who understood them first. Small adjustments, spread across years, each one within the range of a plausible error, accumulating into something that was not an error at all. The ledger showed the estate expenses as slightly higher and the estate income as slightly lower than she believed them to be, and the difference, multiplied across 6 years, was enough to make a certain kind of person very comfortable indeed. She had needed 1 more visit to confirm the pattern, and 1 more to identify the handwriting. Tonight, standing in the conservatory with narcissus pollen on her sleeve, she had 9 days left, and she knew the pattern, and she knew the handwriting. And she now had to face the fact that the handwriting belonged to Mr. Silas Drummond, who was the Alderley estate steward, and who was also the person in whom the Duke of Ashmore placed the greatest degree of professional trust, which meant that the case she was building was going to be uncomfortable to present, and that she was going to need more than a ledger. She needed the original letters. She had known since the second visit that they existed. She had seen the marks where they'd been removed from the file, the ghost of a seal, the pulled thread where a ribbon had tied them. Someone had taken them out and not yet replaced them, and the question was where they had gone and whether they were still readable, and whether she could produce them before Michaelmas in a form that would hold. She had 7 days. She had originally told the Duke 1 week. She revised this, downward, silently, by half a day. Mrs. Alderley was waiting in the corridor outside the conservatory when Mira emerged, which was not entirely surprising, because Mrs. Alderley had a habit of being precisely where information was likely to emerge. "You spoke to Ashmore," said the old woman. "I mentioned the cabinet." "Which cabinet?" "The Chandler House cabinet." Mrs. Alderley considered this. She had a way of standing that communicated extraordinary volumes of opinion without troubling her face. At present, she was communicating relief and calculation in roughly equal measure. "He is not what he looks like," she said. "No," Mira agreed. "He is not. Neither are you." She paused. "Silas Drummond has been here twice this week. He does not usually come twice." Mira looked at her. "He was in the study," said Mrs. Alderley, door closed. "I heard him at the cabinet." Something shifted behind Mira's sternum, not quite alarm, more like a clock being wound past its usual tension. "Did he take anything out?" "I could not say. I heard him at it." "That is all I can tell you." She looked at Mira for a long moment with small, sharp eyes that had been watching elderly men do foolish things for 40 years. "Whatever you are doing, child, I suggest you do it faster." She swept away down the corridor with the authority of a woman who has outlasted every inconvenience offered to her by 3 generations of her family, and Mira stood in the hallway with the narcissus scent still on her sleeves and revised her timeline downward by another half day. She needed the letters. She needed them before Drummond found them first. The Drummond question had a texture she did not like. She had spent some years, as her father's daughter, learning to read people the way her father had read symptoms, by accumulation of small signs rather than any single dramatic indicator. Drummond presented as a man of meticulous, almost ascetic competence. He dressed without vanity, spoke without excess, performed his duties with an efficiency that had earned him not admiration, but a more powerful thing, which was the kind of trust that does not examine itself. He was not the most charming man in any room. He was the quietest. He was consistently present, consistently useful, and consistently the last person the eye sought when looking for the source of anything gone wrong, which was not coincidence. He had a gesture. When he thought no one was observing him, he touched the breast pocket of his coat. Just touched it, the way one touches a thing to check it is still there. She had watched him do it 6 times in her 3 weeks in the house. She had not yet worked out what was in the pocket, but she had a candidate. She had had, for a week, an additional suspicion she had not yet examined completely, because it concerned not the accounts and not the cabinet and not the letters, but her own situation, and examining it fully would require her to act on it, and acting on it would change everything. And she was not yet prepared to change everything until she had secured the rest. She was fairly certain she was with child. She did not permit herself, for the moment, to think about what that meant. She thought about it the way she thought about the deadline, as a fact to be managed rather than a catastrophe to be survived. She had been managing facts for 26 years. She was moderately good at it. She thought about the Duke of Ashmore's hands, which were a working man's hands on a duke's wrists. She thought about the corner of his mouth in the direction of the conservatory. She did not think about any of that, actually. She thought about the letters. She found them on the 4th day. She had not been looking in the correct place, which was the frustrating thing, because the correct place was obvious in retrospect. Not in the study, not behind any panel, not in a cabinet of any color, but in the small locked writing case that Drummond brought with him when he came to the house and that he had set down, on his most recent visit, in the anteroom outside the East Corridor study while he went inside to consult with the Viscount. He had been inside for 40 minutes. The case had been outside for 40 minutes. Mira had been crossing the corridor with a basket of Mrs. Alderley's needlework when she saw it. She had not opened the case. She was not a fool. She noted its dimensions, its lock type, its maker's mark at the corner, and the small asymmetry in the latch that suggested it had been forced at some point and repaired imperfectly. She noted that the lock type could be persuaded by the second smallest key on the ring that her father had left her, which she kept because she had not yet found a reason to leave it. She noted that the case would need to be in her hands for approximately 4 minutes. She noted that the next occasion on which Drummond would be in the study without the case would be the quarterly review, which was in 3 days. She had 3 days. On the 5th day, 2 days before the quarterly review, the Viscount of Alderley came to find her. She was in Mrs. Alderley's sitting room, which was legitimately her territory, sorting the dried samples her father had left her into their correct jars. The Viscount knocked, which was unusual. He generally opened doors as though they had consented in advance. She noted this and kept sorting. "Miss Foss," he said, and then he was quiet for a moment, because he was the sort of man who planned the opening of conversations and then forgot that a conversation requires the other party to respond. She set down the jar. "My lord." He was handsome. She had noted this at the beginning and filed it under irrelevant data, and it remained irrelevant. He had dark eyes and a way of standing that suggested he found his own reflection adequate company, and he looked at her now with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when he was trying to determine what something cost before deciding whether to purchase it. "You have been in England 3 weeks, he said. "I have been in your aunt's employment 3 weeks, she said. "England rather longer." "Yes, quite." He moved to the window, which was either a blocking choice or a nervous habit. She did not yet know him well enough to say which. "You spoke with Ashmore at Chandler House." "I did. He is the estate trustee." "I am aware." He turned from the window. His jaw was set in the way of a man who has decided on a direction and has committed to it before examining whether the destination is sound. "I think we understand each other well enough for me to speak plainly." She waited. "Whatever you imagine you have found," he said, "I would remind you that you are here in a capacity that is, by its nature, dependent on my family's goodwill. You have a position. You have recommendations that could be given or withheld. You have, I think, circumstances that complicate your future considerably." He said this last sentence with the specific gentleness of a man who believes himself to be handling a delicate thing, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the receiving room, except this time he was looking for something in particular, rather than demonstrating something for an audience. He was looking for fear. She let the silence sit for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Are you offering me something, my lord, or threatening me with something? I should prefer to know which, so I can respond appropriately." His jaw tightened. "I am suggesting that discretion has a value." "As does evidence." She turned back to the jars, aligning them on the shelf with the same precision she had used on the ledger columns. "I will think on what you have said." He was quiet for a moment. Then he went out, and this time he did not knock. He simply left, and she listened to his footsteps down the corridor and counted them, and when they were far enough, she exhaled once, carefully, and let herself feel the particular exhaustion of refusing a thing you cannot afford to refuse. She had been offered a position in a house in Bath. She had learned of it 3 days before Alderley's visit. Mrs. Alderley had mentioned it with the careful casualness of a woman setting a table and hoping the guest will notice what she's laid out. The Bath household was decent, well-staffed, and would have required her to leave at once. She had said she could not leave yet. Mrs. Alderley had looked at her for a long moment and had said nothing further on the subject. The cost of staying, Mira had known since the Viscount's visit, was that the Viscount now understood she was looking for something and had not yet decided whether to let her find it. She had 2 days remaining before the quarterly review. She needed him not to move against her for 2 days. She had one tool available, and she did not like using it, and she used it anyway. She sent a note to the Duke of Ashmore. It said only, "I have located the letters. I require 48 hours and access to the quarterly review. I will explain the rest in person." Below this, she wrote her name and folded it and sent it with the most reliable of Mrs. Alderley's 3 household servants, a woman named Gracie, who was 60 years old and moved through every room as though she were made of ambient air, and who had been watching the Alderley household for longer than the Alderley family had been in possession of it. Gracie returned with a note that said, "I will see to the review. Come to the East Library at 4 o'clock, A." She was at the East Library at 4 minutes to 4. He was already there, seated at the library table with his sleeves turned back and a set of accounts open before him. Not the Alderley accounts, something else, something he put aside without comment when she came in. He closed the door behind her himself rather than waiting for her to do it, and she noted that he was one of those people who does not make other people do the small tasks he can do for himself, which told her something about the years that had made him. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She told him about the ledger and the pattern and the accumulated discrepancy and the letters and the writing case. She told him the amount, which she had calculated to the nearest pound. She watched his face during this, which did not change in any externally dramatic way, but which had a quality of deepening attention, the way still water changes when something drops into it. The change is not at the surface, but underneath. He said, when she had finished, "You have been doing this for 3 weeks. "For 3 weeks, yes, alone. I am generally alone. I find it suits the work." He looked at her. Not at her in the way Alderley had looked at her, and not in the way the Assembly had looked at her, and not with the particular appreciation of a man calculating whether she was worth his time. He looked at her the way people look at things they are trying to understand, rather than catalogue. "Miss Voss," he said. "Why?" She considered this question for a moment. It was a genuine one, and it deserved a genuine answer, not the one that came first, because the alternative was to watch your father's work used as a weapon against people who couldn't defend themselves, but the shorter, plainer one beneath it. "Because I saw it," she said. "One does not generally have the option of unseeing it." He was quiet. His hands were on the table, flat, and she noticed again that they were working hands, and she noticed again that she had catalogued this once already, and was cataloguing it again, which was inefficient. "The quarterly review is the day after tomorrow," he said. "Drummond will present the accounts. Yes, and the letters will be in his case. Unless he has moved them. I believe he has not. He does not know I have found them. He believes the threat is abstract. He touched the pocket yesterday." The pocket. She described the gesture. He listened with the same quality of attention, the same underwater depth. "One question," he said. If I open the case at the review and the letters are not there, if I have been wrong or you have been wrong or he has moved them, what happens to you?" She looked at him. "I lose the position. I lose the recommendations. I have a small annuity and my father's samples and 11 years of accumulated knowledge about plants that would poison you, and I am in a condition," she said. And then she paused for the length of one breath, "that makes my present independence a time-limited resource." She had not meant to say that last part. She had decided, clearly, to say that last part because she was not a woman who chose her words by accident, and the decision had been made somewhere below where decisions are usually made, and she was not prepared to examine it in the East Library with the afternoon light moving across the table between them. He was very still. He was still in the specific way of a man who has heard something and is deciding what to do with it, not in the way of a man who does not feel things, but in the way of a man who has learned to hold them very carefully. "How long?" he said. 11 weeks, I believe. 12 at the outermost." Another silence. She felt the strange, specific vulnerability of having told the truth in a room with only one other person, which is different from the kind of truth you can tell in a crowd. He said, "I should tell you something that is also relevant." She waited. "I have known for 3 days," he said, "that Drummond has been falsifying accounts. I have known since the night at Chandler House that the cabinet there was his work too. I had not been able to locate the originating documentation. I had been looking." He paused. In the wrong place. She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them on the table, the afternoon light moved slowly across the grain of the wood. "You already knew," she said. "I suspected. I required proof I could present. You have found the proof." He picked up his pen and set it down again. "What I have not yet told anyone, what I have been unable to tell anyone, because I could not explain how I knew without implicating a source I was not prepared to name, is that Drummond has been feeding the Viscount's creditors false accounts of the estate's value in order to clear his own prior debts with the same parties. The estate is being defrauded in 2 directions simultaneously." He looked at her steadily. "The man who laughed at you in the receiving room does not know this is being done to him." This was a piece of information she had not had. She fitted against the shape she had already built, and the shape became a different thing, not a simple case of embezzlement, but a more complex construction in which the Viscount was simultaneously villain and victim. And the villain was the quiet man with the writing case and the breast pocket he touched when he thought no one was watching. "He will be ruined," she said. "The Viscount. If the accounts come to light as they are, yes, and if they are corrected?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then the estate is solvent, the creditors are paid on accurate figures, and the Viscount survives with his reputation more or less intact and rather less money than he currently believes he has." He paused. He did not make the error. He inherited it. She thought about Alderley's face in the sitting room, the specific gentleness of a frightened man offering a bribe. The way he had said circumstances that complicate your future considerably, which was cruelty, yes, but it was also the cruelty of a man who believed himself to be managing a threat rather than creating one, which was a different thing, not a better thing, but a different one. 2 days, she said. 2 days, he agreed. She went to stand, and he stood first, which she noted, and then she noted that she was noting it, and she went out of the library and walked the long way round to Mrs. Alderley's corridor, because she needed the additional time to put her face back in order. The midpoint blow came the following morning, and she had not anticipated its specific shape, which was her own fault for not following her evidence far enough. She was in the kitchen garden at 8:30, which was where she went when she needed to think without appearing to think, because nobody supervised a companion examining cabbages. She heard the footsteps behind her before she identified them. Light, deliberate, the pace of someone who had rehearsed the approach. Drummond said, pleasantly, "Miss Voss." She turned. He was standing at the garden gate with his hat in his hands, and he was smiling with the gentleness that was his most dangerous expression, and he said, "I wonder if I might speak with you." She said yes, because saying no would tell him too much. He spoke to her for 6 minutes. He spoke about her father, how much he had admired the physician's work, how sad his death, how remarkable it was that his daughter had ended up in this particular household. He spoke about the Duke of Ashmore with specific warmth, with details that she heard as deliberate breadcrumbs. He spoke about the nature of trust and how much it depended on reliable testimony. Then he said, "I understand you have been consulting the estate records." She said, "I keep Mrs. Alderley's household accounts. I occasionally refer to the estate figures for context." He looked at her with small, precise eyes. "Of course." "What I wanted to be certain you understood, as someone who might speak to His Grace at any point about what she had observed, is that figures in draft form can sometimes appear irregular until they are properly countersigned, in which case any irregularity would of course be attributed to the person who had most recently worked with them." He smiled. His voice had not changed. "Before the countersignature." She understood, hearing this, two things simultaneously, that he knew she had been in the study, and that he had already arranged for her handwriting to appear in the ledgers as a countersignature. She understood that the ledger she had read and not touched was not the only ledger, and that the ledger that would be presented at the quarterly review would contain her name, and that the story it would tell was that a physician's daughter with no resources and an inconvenient condition had been helping herself to the accounts. She had one day. She said, "I am very glad you mentioned that. I will be sure to raise any irregularities I noticed with His Grace directly, so that context can be established." She smiled back at him with the same warmth. "Thank you for the clarification." She walked back to the house at a controlled pace. She was 20 feet from the kitchen door before she let herself think, quickly and completely, through what she needed. The writing case, the letters, one day, and the only other person in the house who could tell her something she had not yet been able to confirm. She went directly to Mrs. Alderley. The old woman was at her desk, which was where she spent the hours between breakfast and luncheon, and she looked up when Mira came in with an expression that said she had been expecting this and had been wondering how long it would take. "He's done something," said Mrs. Alderley. "It was not a question. He has put my name in the accounts." Mrs. Alderley was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Gracie." Gracie materialized from behind the dressing room door with the expression of a woman who had been waiting in a dressing room for this exact instruction. "Tell her," said Mrs. Alderley, "what you told me." Gracie squared her hands in her apron, corner to corner. "The case," she said. "He left it in the vestibule for 20 minutes yesterday morning, when the solicitor came for the 7 o'clock. A pause. I had 4 minutes, and I have very small hands." She produced, from the depths of her apron pocket, a folded letter. Mira looked at it. It was addressed in Drummond's careful, meticulous script to a creditor's house in London, dated 6 weeks prior, and it contained a detailed account of the estate's fictitious financial position, complete with figures that matched the draft ledger and were countersigned with Drummond's own seal and the names of 2 witnesses who, upon examination, were the same person under 2 different spellings. She looked at Gracie. "How did you know what to take?" Gracie allowed herself a small, exact smile. "I have been in this house since before Drummond was born," she said. "I know what his handwriting looks like. I know what the ledger looks like. I have been watching him for 2 years. A pause. I was waiting for someone who would know what to do with it. Mrs. Alderley said. From her desk, I told you she was being wasted. Mira looked at the letter in her hand. It was not everything she needed. She needed the letters from the case, and she needed the case open in front of witnesses, but it was the first piece of unambiguous proof in someone else's possession that had not passed through her hands, and it changed the geometry of what was possible. She needed to reach the Duke of Ashmore before Drummond reached the review. She sent a second note. Then, she said about the worst 12 hours she had spent since her father died. The quarterly review was held in the estate library, and by the time Mira arrived at 9:30 in the morning, accompanied by Mrs. Alderley, who had invited herself and communicated clearly to anyone who suggested she leave, that she would require considerable persuasion delivered by someone with superior jaw architecture, there were already 6 people in the room. The Duke of Ashmore was at the head of the table. He had the accounts before him, the true ones, and his face was its usual composed surface, and he did not look at her when she entered, which she had expected, and which meant he had read the note. The Viscount was to his right, looking uncomfortable in the specific way of a man who has been told a meeting is routine and has begun to suspect it is not. Drummond was at the far end of the table, his writing case on the floor beside his chair, his hands folded in his lap, his expression pleasantly, precisely neutral. He looked at Mira when she entered, and he smiled, and she smiled back, and between those two expressions passed a quantity of information that neither of them named aloud. The Alderley family solicitor, Mr. Rowe, was at the Duke's left, a substantial, quietly honest man who had served the estate for 30 years, and who wore the expression of someone who had been made uneasy in advance without being told why. Beside him sat a magistrate from the district court, Sir Henry Fane, who had been invited by the Duke, whose invitation the Duke had not explained in advance, and whose presence was making the Viscount progressively more visibly uncomfortable. And there was Gracie at a writing table in the corner, who had been placed there by Mrs. Alderley to take notes, and who sat with the stillness of someone who has been waiting patiently for a long time for something to arrive. The Duke opened the review at the accounts. He went through them with the measured care of a man who is being correct, publicly, without haste. He raised 2 small questions about figures, each one minor, each one placing a mark on the specific columns Mira had identified. He did not look at Mira. He did not look at Drummond. He looked at the accounts with the patient attention of a man who intends the accounts to say everything without his assistance. Then he said quietly, "Mr. Drummond, I wonder if you might show Mr. Rowe the letter of correspondence to Cartwright's firm that you mentioned in your preliminary summary." Drummond's hands in his lap did not move. Of course, he reached down for the writing case. "Before you open it," said the Duke, in the same tone, no more volume, no more urgency, the voice of a man at breakfast, "I should like Miss Voss to confirm one detail." Every person at the table looked at her. She let them look. "The draft ledger presented to this review," she said, "contains my name as a countersignature on pages 4 through 7. I did not sign those pages. I have not handled that ledger. Mr. Drummond was kind enough to inform me yesterday morning that the signature would appear there." She paused. "In front of the kitchen garden." The Viscount said, "What?" Drummond said nothing. He had very good control, Drummond, she gave him that. "Mr. Drummond," said the Duke, "please open the case." Drummond opened the case. He did it with the precision of a man who is deciding, in real time, which version of events he can still control, and who has not yet conceded that none of them will hold. His hands were steady. He sorted through the papers inside with a careful deliberation that was, she thought, the most controlled performance she had ever watched a person give under these specific circumstances. After a moment, he said, "I cannot find the Cartwright correspondence." "Then I wonder," said the Duke, "if this is it." He produced, from the inside pocket of his coat, the letter that Gracie had taken from the case the previous morning. He held it up, turned it toward the light from the east window, and read aloud the relevant passage, the false figures, the double-spelled witness names, the date. Drummond's hands stopped moving. Sir Henry Fane leaned forward. "These are your figures, Drummond," said the Duke. It was not a question. He set the letter on the table and turned it toward the magistrate. "You will observe the signature and seal." "Those were draft figures," Drummond said. His voice had not changed. It was still pleasant, still careful. "Preliminary estimates, subject to—" "Countersignature?" said Mira. He looked at her. "Like the ledger?" she said. The silence in the room was the kind of silence that has weight and edges. She felt it press. The Viscount was very still in the way of a man trying to understand a large change rapidly, and she watched him piece it together in his face, not in his expression, which stayed controlled, but in the small adjustments of his hands on the table, the way he moved his ring finger and then stopped. "You have been falsifying my estate accounts," said the Viscount. His voice was flat, with a flatness that was not composure, but the space where composure used to be before it had been taken out and shown to be load-bearing. Drummond said, with the last of his pleasant manner, "My lord, I have managed this estate for 16 years in circumstances, with your own seal." The Viscount cut across him with the same flatness, "presenting false figures to my creditors, to free you from debts that were themselves the product of accounts you had already tampered with." Yes, it was the Duke who said this. He said it without particular emphasis, as a fact among facts. The total discrepancy across 6 years is £4,912. He turned to the solicitor. "Miss Rowe, does the estate hold that figure in liquid form?" Rowe, who had been sitting with the expression of a man in the presence of a disaster he'd been told was a routine inspection, collected himself with visible effort. "It does. Very nearly." "Then the estate is solvent." He turned to Sir Henry Fane. "The documentation is yours, Sir Henry." Drummond was looking at his hands. He was no longer reaching into the writing case. He was sitting with his hands in his lap again, and the gesture he had always made, the touch to the breast pocket, the checking of something present, was still. And she watched him not make it, and she saw in that stillness what she had missed, which was the thing behind the envy and the arithmetic of money. The thing that had started it, which was grief. There was something in the pocket. There had been something in the pocket for 16 years. A paper, she thought, or a miniature, or something small enough to carry and old enough to be a before. She did not know what it was. She thought she knew what it was. The Duke said, "Drummond, whatever the original cause, whatever debt or promise was the start of this, I will ask the court to consider it. I will not argue for severity." He said this plainly, as a statement of policy rather than compassion, and she thought it was both. "You have managed the estate for 16 years, and you were not always doing this. That period has a claim." Drummond looked up. His face was a complex thing. He said nothing. "You will leave the county," said the Duke. "The financial restitution will be structured to allow it. You will be described, to anyone who asks, as having retired at your own request." He paused. "This is not generosity to you. It is protection of the people in this estate who depend on the estate's reputation, and who had no part in any of this." It was Mira who said, in the kitchen, before morning service, there is a woman named Aldous who has been with this estate since before Drummond was hired. Her sister's family is his. She said it without inflection. I mention it as a relevant fact. The Duke did not look at her. But he said, to Drummond, her employment is not affected. Her sister's connection is not recorded. Drummond closed his eyes for one moment. When he opened them, he said, quietly, I am sorry for the ledger. He said it to Mira. I was afraid. She looked at him. She thought about what was in the pocket. She thought about the arithmetic of a grief that had gone on long enough to become something worse than itself. I know, she said. That was all. Sir Henry Fane took custody of the letter and the accounts. The Viscount sat with his hands flat on the table and his face very still, and said nothing further until everyone else had gone, and he was left with Mira and the Duke, and Mrs. Alderley in the corner because Mrs. Alderley had declined to leave. Then he said, to Mira, you knew before I did. I knew something was wrong with the accounts. I did not know the full shape of it. He was quiet. He looked at his hands. He was not the man he had been in the receiving room, and she thought it was the knowledge that had changed him, the specific knowledge that the situation he had been managing badly and unkindly, and toward people who did not deserve it, was not the situation he was actually in. He said, finally, the kitchen garden. Yes, I told you, you did. He looked at her. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite shame and was not quite apology, but was the territory between them where both live before they are named. You did not leave, he said. I needed the quarterly review, she said. He almost very nearly smiled. It did not reach his face. But it reached something adjacent to it. Yes, he said. I imagine you did. He stood. He straightened his coat, which did not need straightening, the way men straighten things when they are putting themselves back in order. He said, Miss Voss, in a tone that was simply her name and nothing further, and he went out, and the door fell shut behind him with no drama and no proclamation. Mrs. Alderley said from her corner, well, Mira sat down, because her knees had decided that the theatrics of the last hour had exhausted their contractual obligations. She sat down and breathed in and breathed out, and the morning light came through the east window and lay itself across the table where the accounts had been, and somewhere in the house a bird was singing the way birds do when they are conducting their business without reference to human events. Which was, she thought, the correct position. The Duke had not yet left the room. He was at the window. He had been at the window since Alderley went out. She had noted this without making it mean anything, and then she had noted that she was not making it mean anything, and then she had noted that the effort of not making it mean anything was somewhat larger than it should have been if it meant nothing. He said, still at the window, the kitchen garden statement. She waited. You said that in the room. About Aldous, about her sister. He turned from the window. You did not have to say it. No, she agreed. I thought it was relevant. It was mercy, he said. I want to be precise about the terminology. She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them, the morning was continuing, without their guidance. There is a thing I should like to ask you, he said, which is entirely separate from the accounts, and from the case, and from any obligation or consideration attending either. I want to be clear that it is separate. It has been separate since the conservatory. She waited. I have been alone, he said, for 7 years. Not for lack of company, for lack of anyone who looked at the cabinet. He stopped. He said, that is not what I mean to say. What I mean to say is that my brother's life was saved by your father, who was a man of extraordinary exactness and profound practical compassion, and who spent his life in the service of people who frequently could not pay him, and who appears to have left you everything worth leaving, his kit, his knowledge, his eye for the hidden thing, and his habit of standing in the wrong room at the wrong time and making it come right. He paused. What I mean to say is, marry me because you wish it. It is the only reason I will accept. She was quiet. She let herself be quiet. Outside the window, the bird continued its business. She said, "You said in the conservatory that my father saved your brother's life." "Yes, he sent for payment afterward. My father never sent for payment first. He sent a letter." Yes, he was watching her with the patient attention she had catalogued twice already. "He told me about that account," she said, "when he was teaching me the books. He used it as an example. He said there was an account he had decided to consider permanently open, because some debts are not actually debts. They are simply the fact that some things cannot be given back." He was very still. "I still have the ledger," she said. "His ledger. It says, Ashmore, Jonathan." She stopped, and she felt the thing that was under all the composure and all the cataloging and all the standing in the right place at the right time, the thing that had been there since the conservatory and had survived the kitchen garden and the quarterly review and Drummond's face in defeat, the thing that was simply the truth. It says, Ashmore, Jonathan. Settled, with love. He crossed the room. He did not hurry. He moved the way careful men move when they have decided on a direction and have examined the destination and found it sound, and he stood before her and said, very quietly, "Yes." She said, "Yes." And then she said, "But you should know that I intend to continue to be very difficult about accounts," he said, and this time the corner of his mouth moved the full distance it had been approaching since the conservatory, Miss Voss. "I am counting on it." Mrs. Alderley wept at the wedding. She had announced in advance that she would not, and she wore the expression throughout the ceremony of a woman who is making good on a prior commitment to composure, and she managed it entirely until Mira handed back the single dried narcissus that had been on the trestle in the conservatory on the night of the first conversation, which she had pressed into the pages of her father's ledger, and which she now put in the Duke's hand and said, simply, "He would have liked you." And then Mrs. Alderley's campaign for composure was decisively overrun, and she said, briskly, to no one in particular, "Dust." Extraordinary amount of dust in this chapel, and Gracie handed her a handkerchief with the expression of a woman who had been carrying that handkerchief to exactly this deployment for 3 weeks. It was a very small wedding. October by then, which suited them both. The heat that had pressed since the summer had finally broken in a storm the night the accounts were settled, and the autumn came in with clear light and sharp mornings, and the smell of turned earth that Mira associated with her father's garden, and with all the things that rest after they have done their work. The Viscount of Alderley was not present. He had been in Yorkshire since September, where a cousin had recommended him for a position managing a small agricultural estate, and where he was, by all accounts, proving more careful and more thoughtful than the particular shape of his earlier life had suggested he might be. He had sent a letter. She had read it. She had written back one sentence, "I am glad of you in Yorkshire." She had meant it. Drummond was in Dorset with his sister's family. No charges had been formally brought. The financial restitution was being made in quarterly installments, which had been structured, at the Duke's instruction and with Mr. Rowe's thorough implementation, to leave Drummond with enough to live on without comfort, but also without despair. She did not know what was in the breast pocket. She did not ask. She thought she knew. Gracie was made head of household at Ashmore, which was not a lateral move. Mrs. Alderley had said at the announcement that it was the most overdue promotion in the recorded history of the county, and Gracie had received it with the same expression she gave every piece of news. The expression of a woman who had already accounted for the probability. Sir Henry Fane had retired in November and had taken, to general local astonishment, to beekeeping. Mr. Rowe had the accounts in order and had been heard to say, to a colleague, that the new Duchess had a gift for figures that was, in his considered professional opinion, somewhat alarming. Redeemable rivals, there had been, in the rooms adjacent to all of this, a woman named Miss Lorne, polished, composed, who had understood what was happening in the East Library from her position in the corridor outside, and who had come to Mira 3 days afterward and said, "I was wrong about what was worth admiring." Mira had said, "I know. You are not wrong about it now." Miss Lorne had gone north in spring to manage her grandmother's estate, which needed managing, and which, under management, did not need to be sold after all. The spring came with new light and a warmth that was a different thing from the summer's pressing heat, an offering rather than a weight. They were in the kitchen garden when she found it, a narcissus, early, stubborn, in the bed where no narcissus had been planted in anyone's memory. She stopped when she saw it. He came to stand beside her. He stood in the way he had stood in the Chandler house's receiving room, simply present, as though the space arranged itself around him. He looked at the flower. She said, "One does not generally have the option of unseeing it." He looked at her. She looked at him. The morning was continuing without their guidance, and the bird was singing, and somewhere in the house a new small person was asleep in the specific comprehensive way of new small people, and between them in the garden the narcissus was conducting its business with the indifference of things that simply are. "No," he said. One doesn't. If this story stayed with you, if you felt something ease in you when the truth finally came into the light with its witnesses and its object and its one precise question, then you already know what this fire is for. Pull up your chair. The kettle is on. The candle is exactly where you left it. Tell me in the comments the moment Mira said, "I did not sign those pages." Did you know then that she had already won? Or did you hold your breath until the letter came out of his coat? I want to know when you knew. If these fireside stories are the kind you find yourself thinking about on a Thursday for no reason you can name, there is a chair kept for you here. Subscribe, and we will save it. Sleep well tonight, and be careful with the ones who stand in the wrong room at the right time and make it come right.